Have you ever noticed that not everyone writes the same way? In many countries, words flow from left to right. In others, they move in the exact opposite direction, from right to left. And in some places, like ancient Chinese, writing descended in vertical columns. It might seem like just a graphical choice, but the direction of writing reveals much more than it appears at first glance. Throughout history, different civilizations created their own writing systems, shaped by materials, ergonomics, and culture. But how did these habits become established in each region? And more importantly, why do we, specifically, write from left to right?
Since ancient times, human beings have sought to record ideas, laws, and events through writing. But there's something curious about this seemingly simple act, the direction in which the words are arranged. Why do we write from left to right? Has it always been that way? Is this pattern a natural rule at a human brain, or just a practical choice that became dominant over time? Throughout this video, we'll explore how different cultures thought, wrote, and shaped the course of our reading and writing systems. Get ready to uncover the fascinating story behind a daily gesture. And if you want to see more videos like this, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to follow our upcoming episodes. Latin writing, which we use so naturally today, went through a long and complex journey before taking on its current form. Interestingly, it was not always read from left to right. The earliest Latin inscriptions show a fluctuation in writing direction, sometimes moving one way, sometimes the other, following habits inherited from earlier systems. This phenomenon reflects a culture in the process of consolidation, absorbing influences from neighboring civilizations and adapting its writing system to suit its own material and social conditions. In this context, writing direction was not just a visual convention, but a practical and cultural outcome shaped by multiple factors. A remarkable example of this fluctuation is the use of boustrophedon, a zigzag writing style in which one line runs from left to right and the next from right to left, alternating continuously. The term comes from ancient Greek and literally means "as the oxen plows," referencing the motion of oxen in a field. This writing method was not just a curiosity, it represented a functional stage in the graphic evolution of some civilizations. Among the Greeks and Etruscans, boustrophedon is used in steles and official inscriptions, marking a visual and cultural transition in the way language was recorded. This format also appeared in early Latin records, showing its significance in shaping the Latin system. The origin of Latin writing traces back to a lineage beginning in Egypt with hieroglyphs. The symbolic complexity of Egyptian writing served as the foundation for the creation of the Proto-Sinaitic script, a more phonetic and direct system that emerged around 1800 BCE in the Sinai region. This system was a crucial link between Egyptian symbols and future Semitic alphabets. From Proto-Sinaitic, the Canaanite script developed, reduced in symbols and more focused on phonetics. The Canaanite script later evolved into Phoenician, one of the most influential alphabets in human history. It's at this point that the Latin writing path begins to form more clearly, shaped by cultural influence and Mediterranean trade. The Phoenician alphabet was a turning point in the history of writing systems. It simplified the representation of human speech into around 20 basic signs, making reading and writing much more accessible. Its direction was from right to left, which directly influenced other Semitic languages like Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. However, when the Greeks adopted and adapted this alphabet to their own language, they began experimenting with different writing directions, including boustrophedon. This Greek flexibility opened the way for future changes, especially when the writing system passed on to the Etruscans, who inhabited the Italian peninsula and would eventually transmit it to the Romans. The Etruscans were crucial in adapting the Greek alphabet to local needs in the Italian peninsula.
While they preserved many elements of the Greek model, they also introduced changes in letter shapes and layout. Etruscan inscriptions show a variation in writing direction, shifting between right to left and boustrophedon, before eventually leaning toward left to right. This variation indicates that no standard had yet been established. Rather, it was a period of experimentation. It was within this environment that the Romans adopted the script and began to structure it more systematically, laying the foundation for what we now call Latin writing. The transition from Etruscan to Latin writing was not abrupt. For centuries, Roman writing retained archaic traits, including directional variation and letter forms that were not yet standardized. Ancient Latin inscriptions reveal a coexistence of different graphic orientations depending on the location, scribe, and material used. Over time, the script became more consolidated in the left-to-right direction, especially as ink on papyrus or parchment became more common, demanding greater visual fluidity and organization. This gradual standardization was essential for Latin writing to become a lasting reference across different regions of the world. This historical path shows that writing direction is deeply tied to cultural, material, and ergonomic factors. Writing is not just a graphic system to represent sound. It reflects how a society visually organizes its language. In the case of Latin writing, the left-to-right direction was neither immediate nor spontaneous. It was the result of a long chain of cultural influence, from the Egyptians to the Etruscans, each adding layers to the system. With its increasingly defined graphic structure, Latin would go on to shape much of written communication in the Western world. But to fully understand that consolidation, we need to delve deeper into the historical roots behind its formation.
The journey of Western writing has its deepest roots in ancient Egyptian soil, where the first organized graphic systems began to emerge around 3200 BCE. The Egyptians developed one of the most complex and long-lasting systems of antiquity, hieroglyphs. This system combined phonetic symbols, logograms, and ideograms in highly elaborate calligraphy, used both for sacred texts and administrative records. The direction of Egyptian writing varied depending on context and aesthetics. It could be horizontal, vertical, left to right, or right to left. Visual criteria prevailed, and hieroglyphs were arranged to fit the symmetry of temple walls, tombs, and official monuments, reinforcing the link between calligraphy, medium, and cultural influence. Despite the sophistication of hieroglyphs, the system was largely inaccessible to most of the Egyptian population, restricted to specialized scribes. In this environment, around 1800 BCE, Semitic-speaking workers living in the Sinai region began adapting elements of Egyptian hieroglyphs to create a new type of script, simpler, more direct, and focused on the phonetic representation of spoken language. This system, known as the Proto-Sinaitic, marked a fundamental shift in writing history by reducing complex imagery into specific symbols for sounds. Still rudimentary, this change was the first real step toward an alphabetic system, shaped not just by aesthetics, but also by practicality and the need to record information on a variety of materials. Proto-Sinaitic didn't emerge by chance. It was a spontaneous solution to a practical problem. These Semitic workers, likely engaged in mining and trade in the Sinai, needed an efficient way to record names, routes, and goods. Drawing inspiration from the hieroglyphs, they created symbols that represented consonant sounds in their spoken language, the early seed of the alphabetic principle. The system was primarily carved into stone and clay, and its writing direction was not yet standardized, changing dependent on context. Clay, for instance, allowed for quicker inscription and directly influenced the direction of writing, adapting to the scribe's dominant hand and the surface's shape. From the Proto-Sinaitic system emerged what would later be known as Canaanite script, recognized as the first fully functional alphabet in history. This new system further reduced the number of signs and focused exclusively on consonant sounds, simplifying learning and expanding its use across different peoples. Over time, the Canaanite script would directly influence the Phoenician alphabet, which played a central role in spreading writing across the Mediterranean. As the system became simpler, the relationship between materials like stone, papyrus, or clay and writing direction grew more relevant, shaping each civilization's ergonomic choices. Every people who adopted a script had to decide, practically, how to organize their words on the page. At this early stage, writing systems were not isolated. They were constantly in contact. Egypt, as a center of trade and regional power, had a decisive role in shaping the graphic thought of the Near East. Egyptian cultural influence can be seen not only in symbol shapes, but in the very conception of writing as a sacred and administrative tool. The use of ink on papyrus required care with writing direction to avoid smudging, especially for right-handed scribes. This would later influence other cultures that adopted ink-based systems, encouraging writing from left to right to prevent the hand from smearing the wet text. Another important aspect to consider is that Egyptians used different scripts for different purposes: hieratic for religious and administrative documents, and demotic for more everyday texts. These variants were simpler than traditional hieroglyphs and better suited for ink on papyrus. This type of adaptation shows how available materials and usage contexts shaped the evolution of writing systems over time. Once again, writing direction was influenced both by these practical factors and by inherited tradition. Writing was no longer just a set of symbols. It began to incorporate ergonomic and functional elements, increasingly aligned with daily life needs. Thus, Egypt not only created one of antiquity's longest-lasting writing systems, but also indirectly served as the cradle of the phonetic revolution that would emerge from the Proto-Sinaitic. This transition from a symbolic visual system to a phonetic linear one marks one of the most important milestones in the history of writing. From this point, the path was open for the rise of even more accessible systems, such as Phoenician and later Greek and Latin. However, to fully understand this evolution, we must examine how each people absorbed these influences and adapted them to their own realities, with particular emphasis on the Phoenicians, who would take the next major leap.
The evolution from Proto-Sinaitic to Canaanite script marked a decisive leap in the history of writing systems. This new model, more streamlined and standardized, eliminated visual complexity and focused solely on consonantal sounds. By the 14th century BCE, the Canaanites, Semitic peoples inhabiting regions of present-day Syria, Israel, and Lebanon, adapted Proto-Sinaitic symbols into a more functional and regular structure. Through this process, the first fully functional alphabetic system emerged, with a small set of signs that could be learned and reproduced with relative ease. This shift marked a definitive break from hieroglyphic or cuneiform systems, making writing accessible far beyond the elites. Over time, Canaanite script gave rise to the Phoenician alphabet, which quickly spread through maritime trade routes dominated by the Phoenicians. The cultural influence of this people was immense, not only for their navigational and colonial reach, but also for the dissemination of their writing system. The Phoenicians established trading posts throughout the Mediterranean, carrying with them their simple, direct, and efficient alphabet. Phoenician writing flowed from right to left, a direction inherited from Canaanite tradition and maintained for centuries. This orientation would later influence other scripts, such as Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic, all of which preserved the same directionality. The structure of the Phoenician alphabet included about 22 consonants, with no explicit vowels. Despite this limitation, the system worked effectively, as readers could identify the correct sounds from context. The success of the Phoenician alphabet was also due to its graphic simplicity, which allowed for quick inscription on clay, stone, or metal, as well as writing with ink on lighter materials like papyrus. The right-to-left direction made ergonomic sense for right-handed scribes using styluses or wet ink, as it prevented their hands from smearing the freshly written text. Practical concerns, combined with cultural habits, reinforced this writing flow in everyday use. Beyond its practical efficiency, the Phoenician alphabet gained strength through its close link to commerce. The Phoenicians were master traders, and the need to record contracts, goods, and transactions demanded a fast and reliable writing method. The alphabet became not only a cultural tool, but also an economic asset. Wherever they traveled, whether in North Africa, Mediterranean islands, or the Iberian Peninsula, the Phoenicians left behind their written mark. And with it, they spread the practice of writing from right to left, solidifying this orientation as the standard throughout much of the ancient Middle East and North Africa. The influence of the Phoenician alphabet on other writing systems was so significant that it served as the foundation for new alphabets adapted to different languages. One key example was the Greek alphabet, which borrowed the Phoenician structure and modified it to suit the sounds and grammar of the Greek language. Initially, the Greeks maintained the right-to-left direction. Over time, however, they began alternating it with boustrophedon and eventually standardized the left-to-right flow. That change would come later. At this point in history, the focus remains on the Phoenicians, who consistently preserved the tradition of writing from right to left with little deviation. Another relevant point is that Phoenician writing lacked punctuation or spacing between words. Texts were continuous, requiring a degree of familiarity from readers. Still, the system worked because words were short and context helped with interpretation. The Phoenician calligraphy also underwent minor regional variations, especially in colonies throughout the Mediterranean. Despite those differences, the direction of writing remained constant, showing how cultural inertia preserved certain graphic standards even amid linguistic or material changes. Writing direction, in this sense, became a cultural legacy as much as a practical decision. The birth of the Phoenician alphabet was not only a technical innovation, it marked a new era in written communication. For the first time, a civilization had created a system that could be replicated, learned, and exported with great efficiency. Economic, political, and religious systems grew stronger thanks to this widespread graphic model. The right-to-left direction, inherited from the Canaanites, was preserved not by coincidence, but because it made sense within the technological and practical context at the time. Still, the history of writing direction was far from over. From this point forward, new cultures would reinterpret that legacy, and some of them would completely reverse the direction in which reading began. As the Phoenician alphabet spread across Mediterranean trade routes, it was gradually absorbed and adapted by various cultures. Among them, the Greeks were the first to make significant structural changes, adding vowels and adjusting shapes to represent sounds absent in Phoenician. Still, despite these modifications, the Greeks initially preserved the right-to-left writing direction, as inherited from Phoenician sedition. This direct influence shows that writing wasn't just a technical tool, but also a reflection of cultural influence exerted by powerful economic and political civilizations. During this stage, writing still lacked fixed standards, and different Greek regions displayed graphical and directional variations. Over time, the Greeks began experimenting with boustrophedon writing, alternating the direction of reading with each line. This method allowed continuous reading without returning to the start of the previous line, a practical solution for long inscriptions carved in stone. This intermediate phase shows how the Greeks were in a transitional and experimental process, seeking a more fluid and functional way to organize writing. Boustrophedon became common in steles, monuments, and public documents, reflecting the Greek system's flexibility. This practice also highlights how materials, like clay, stone, or ink on papyrus, directly influenced writing direction choices. While the Greeks gradually transitioned to a new direction, other peoples firmly maintained the inherited tradition. Hebrew, for example, preserved the right-to-left direction, directly inherited from the Phoenician structure. Hebrew writing solidified as a consonantal system, with letters adapted to the language's phonology, and only later included vowel diacritics. The writing materials used, often papyrus and later parchment, also supported this direction, especially for right-handed scribes. This graphic continuity shows how writing systems can retain traditional elements for centuries, even amid significant linguistic and technological changes. The same occurred with Arabic, whose script also developed from Semitic systems influenced by the Phoenicians. Arabic calligraphy became known for its fluidity, visual aesthetics, and adaptability across different surfaces. From early inscriptions to the elaborate manuscripts of the medieval Islamic world, the right-to-left direction was strictly maintained. This choice was not only culturally inherited, but also practical. When writing with liquid ink on paper or parchment, a right-handed scribe would not smear the freshly written text. This ergonomic factor, combined with tradition, helped preserve the writing direction as a consistent standard in the Arabic world. Aramaic, a Semitic language that spread across the Fertile Crescent from the 8th century BCE, also inherited the Phoenician graphic structure. It became one of the most widely spoken languages of the Near East and served as the base for other systems, such as Syriac and Old Persian. In all of these derived systems, the right-to-left writing direction remained intact, reinforcing a standard established centuries earlier. Aramaic's role as a lingua franca during the Persian Empire helped standardize P script features, including direction. This shows how alphabets were not just graphic inventions, but also geopolitical tools, accompanying the rise and consolidation of empires. Thus, the choice of writing direction went far beyond calligraphy itself. It was embedded in a broader context involving religion, politics, commerce, and social organization. In Semitic traditions, preserving right-to-left writing became a symbol of cultural identity. Even as new materials and writing formats emerged, this direction proved resilient, enduring across centuries and surviving into the modern age. This demonstrates how seemingly simple elements, like reading direction, can carry profound meanings, marking boundaries between civilizations and distant ways of organizing thought. Meanwhile, other cultures stemming from the same Phoenician alphabet began diverging in their graphic choices. The Greeks, over time, abandoned boustrophedon and fully embraced left-to-right writing, directly influencing the Etruscans and later the Romans. This moment represents a turning point in the history of writing direction. On one side, traditions preserving the original orientation. On the other, those choosing to alter it. From here on, the ancient world would begin to follow distinct paths, not only in language, but in how they visually arranged ideas on a surface. And this inflection point would prove decisive for the emergence of Latin writing as we know it today.
The transition from Greek to Etruscan writing marked a decisive step in consolidating the left-to-right direction. When the Greeks began standardizing this new reading direction around the 5th century BCE, they directly influenced nearby peoples, especially the Etruscans. This civilization, located in central Italy before the rise of Rome, adopted an early Greek alphabet, modifying it to fit their phonetic needs. Although some Etruscan inscriptions still showed direction variations, including occasional use of boustrophedon, there was a growing tendency to adopt left-to-right writing. That orientation gradually became dominant across their inscriptions and administrative texts. The Etruscans played a fundamental role as cultural intermediaries between the Greeks and the emerging Roman civilization. While their script was based on the Greek model, the Etruscans introduced changes in letter forms and representations to suit the phonetics of their language. These linguistic adaptations also demanded graphical adjustments, shaping a script that could effectively serve everyday communication. The direction of writing followed these changes, favoring a linear and practical organization, especially with the growing use of ink on papyrus or parchment. Writing ergonomics became increasingly relevant as written records expanded into administrative, legal, and public domains. As the Romans began rising as a political and cultural force, they directly inherited the Etruscan alphabet. It was from this foundation that the Latin alphabet was formed, the same one that would spread across the Roman Empire and, with modifications, endure into the modern era. Early Latin inscriptions still showed some irregularities, including reversed letters or inconsistent forms. However, as Rome expanded and needed to govern vast territories, standardizing writing became a priority. The left-to-right direction became fixed, not only as an Etruscan legacy, but also as a functional solution for organizing texts in military, legal, and religious contexts. The consolidation of Latin writing as the Roman standard deeply shaped how texts were produced and transmitted. Writing direction influenced paragraph layout, the arrangement of columns in public records, and even the format of books. The use of papyrus scrolls and later the codex, a bound collection of sheets, reinforced the logic of reading from left to right. This structure allowed greater reading flow and easier reference to specific sections, which was crucial for legal, philosophical, and literary works. Roman calligraphy also evolved during this period, adopting distinct styles depending on the purpose of the text and the material used. It's important to note that Latin, as Rome's official language, was written with tools that demanded precision. Brushes, quills, and liquid ink required careful direction to avoid smearing the written text. This naturally favored right-handed scribes writing from left to right, since their hand wouldn't drag across fresh ink. Once again, writing direction wasn't just cultural, it was also ergonomic and technical, shaped by the type of surface, tools, and conditions of use. Over time, this direction became a stable standard, passed down through generations and reinforced in education and administration. As the Roman Empire expanded across Europe, the Latin alphabet and its left-to-right orientation were replicated throughout its provinces. From North Africa to the British Isles, the visual layout of text followed the Roman model. After the empire's fall, this system was preserved by religious and legal institutions, especially the Catholic Church. Even as Romance languages like Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Italian emerged, the left-to-right writing direction remained a shared trait. This standard, shaped by centuries of adaptation and influence, would define Western written structure for the centuries that followed. Thus, modern Latin writing is the result of a transmission process involving the Greeks, Etruscans, and Romans. Each civilization received this heritage and reshaped it to meet its linguistic, cultural, and material needs. The final choice to write from left to right wasn't just an abstract convention. It was influenced by practical factors, letter forms, ink type, hand positioning, text format, and accumulated cultural influence. What seems natural today for millions of people is in fact the outcome of centuries of historical transformation. And yet, the story of writing direction doesn't end here. Other peoples followed entirely different paths, starting from independent origins.
Long before the rise of the Phoenician script or the Latin alphabet, the civilizations of Mesopotamia had already developed a highly complex writing system, cuneiform. Created by the Sumerians around 3200 BCE, this system is recognized as the oldest known form of writing. At first, cuneiform consisted of pictograms drawn on wet clay tablets using wedge-shaped styluses. Over time, these images evolved into more abstract signs composed of vertical, horizontal, and diagonal strokes, engraved quickly and precisely. The term cuneiform comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, referring to the distinctive shape of the marks left in the clay. Unlike the later Phoenician tradition, which would emerge millennia later, cuneiform writing had a predominantly left-to-right direction. This choice was directly related to how right-handed scribes handled their styluses when writing on clay. As writing became organized in horizontal lines, replacing earlier vertical columns or free-form arrangements, ergonomics dictated the directional standard. Writing from left to right prevented the hand from smudging the still damp characters. Thus, the writing material and the ergonomics of inscription directly influenced how the system became standardized in the daily practices of the Sumerians and the peoples who followed them. Cuneiform was not exclusive to the Sumerians. It was later adopted and adapted by various other Mesopotamian civilizations, such as the Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Elamites. Each of these cultures incorporated the system into their own languages, making adjustments to the phonetic representations and symbol organization. Despite differences, most retained the left-to-right direction, partly out of tradition, but also for practical reasons. Clay tablets remained the primary medium, and handling them required clear and efficient spatial organization. In this context, the direction of writing reflected both cultural continuity and adaptation to the technical demands of a writing environment. A striking feature of cuneiform was its high graphic density. A single tablet could contain dozens or even hundreds of signs, each representing syllables, words, or complex concepts. Reading required specialized training, limiting literacy to an elite class of scribes. Still, the system was widely used in administrative, religious, and literary contexts. From trade agreements to mythical epics like Gilgamesh, cuneiform demonstrated versatility and an ability to record the complexity of the ancient world. The calligraphy of these texts followed a strict visual standard, and the direction of writing directly influenced how information was structured and retrieved. Despite the rigidity of tablet formats, scribes developed varied styles for different purposes. Smaller tablets, for example, were used for personal messages, inventory lists, or accounting records, while larger ones contained official or religious texts. In all cases, cultural influence and a left-to-right tradition remained consistent, reinforced by formal training in temple schools. Mastery of calligraphy and spatial arrangement was a vital part of scribal education, ensuring the preservation and transmission of records across generations. These practices shaped the cognitive and bureaucratic systems of Mesopotamian society. As other writing systems emerged, such as Semitic alphabets and later Greek and Latin scripts, cuneiform gradually declined. However, its influence remained, not only in preserved documents, but also in administrative habits and data recording techniques absorbed by other cultures. The logic of organizing information in horizontal lines and starting on the left was retained in many later traditions. Although cuneiform wasn't an alphabet, its phonetic structure and systematic use in state and commercial functions anticipated many principles found in modern writing systems. Cuneiform writing, therefore, represents an origin independent from the Phoenician alphabetic tradition. Its autonomous development, left-to-right direction, and practical use in real contexts make it a crucial example for understanding how material and functional conditions shape writing direction. Observing this system reveals that the choice of where to begin writing is not random. It responds to technical, social, and ergonomic factors.
And even though cuneiform eventually disappeared as an active system, its structural logic would continue to echo in the graphic traditions of many future civilizations.
While writing in the West was shaped by Phoenician and Mesopotamian legacies, an entirely distinct and autonomous system emerged in the Far East, ancient Chinese writing. Unlike alphabetic traditions, this system was based on logograms, symbols that represented whole words or complex concepts. The earliest inscriptions date back to the Shang dynasty, around 1200 BCE, and were engraved on bones and turtle shells used for divination. Over time, writing transitioned to more practical surfaces, such as bamboo, and the use of black ink applied with a brush became dominant. The visual form of the characters reflected both their function and the available materials, shaping calligraphy as an expression of culture, ritual, and administration. The direction of traditional Chinese writing was top to bottom, with columns arranged right to left. This pattern was not random. It was directly tied to the format of the writing surfaces, especially bamboo scrolls. These consisted of wooden or bamboo strips bound by cords, forming a vertical sequence. The scribe would hold the scroll with the left hand and write with the right, positioning the brush at the top of a column and moving downward before shifting to the next column, located to the left. There was a clear practical logic guiding both stroke direction and reading flow, aligned with the ergonomics of writing and the way the scrolls were unrolled for reading. This vertical system was reinforced by the graphical structure of the characters themselves, which were generally taller than they were wide. Visually, they fit better in vertical columns than in horizontal lines. Aesthetic values also played a role. Calligraphy was considered an art form, and the visual arrangement of columns supported balance and harmony, principles highly regarded in Chinese tradition. At the same time, liquid ink required controlled hand movement and paper positioning, which made vertical writing from right to left ideal for avoiding smudges, especially for right-handed scribes. In this context, writing direction was the product of material, cultural, and technical convergence. With the introduction of paper and bound books during the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century CE, new writing formats began to appear. Even so, the traditional structure remained dominant for many centuries. Whether handwritten or printed using woodblocks, texts continued to follow the vertical, right-to-left format. Only in the 20th century, with modernization and westernization of education and publishing, did China partially adopt horizontal, left-to-right writing in modern publications. Still, the vertical format is used today in formal, artistic, and traditional settings, showing the enduring power of a model with deep historical roots. Ancient Chinese writing also spread to other parts of East Asia, directly influencing the calligraphy of Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. In many of these cultures, writing direction followed the same Chinese pattern, vertical columns read from right to left. This regional standard reinforced China's cultural influence over its neighbors while establishing a distinct text layout. This writing model was transmitted through schools, temples, and official texts, ensuring the preservation of a style that lasted for centuries despite linguistic and political changes over time. Thus, ancient Chinese writing developed along a path entirely separate from that of the West. Its graphic system, physical mediums, and calligraphic practices were shaped by internal dynamics, from material constraints to aesthetic and functional principles. The choice to write top to bottom, with columns moving right to left, was born of practical needs rather than arbitrary conventions. Once again, this shows how writing direction is determined by a complex web of technical, visual, and social factors, not just inherited habits or formal decisions by ruling elites. Even today, in the 21st century, the traditional direction of Chinese writing can be seen in formal calligraphy, public inscriptions, temples, ceremonies, and traditional art.
although horizontal left-to-right formats are now common in books, newspapers, and digital media, the vertical model retains strong symbolic and cultural value. This reinforces the idea that writing direction holds not only a practical role, but also an identity marker. In the case of ancient China, that identity was shaped over centuries, passed through generations, and adapted as technologies changed, while always preserving its link to the past.
When we talk about writing direction, it's easy to assume there's a single natural or correct path. But when we observe other civilizations, we realize there's no absolute standard. Peoples like the Maya, for instance, developed a writing system completely independent of the Phoenician tradition, based on distinct principles of graphic representation, aesthetics, and materiality. The Mayan script emerged around the 3rd century BCE and used a complex combination of ideograms and phonograms, carved in stone, painted on ceramics, or written in bark paper codices. It was a highly visual, intricate, and symbolic writing system with strong aesthetic and religious elements. Unlike Western patterns, the arrangement of text blocks could vary greatly depending on the desired composition, columns, rows, or even spirals. Mayan scribes wrote from top to bottom and left to right, but this direction could change depending on the medium and the ritual function of the text. In some codices, such as the famous Dresden Codex, the texts are organized in vertical columns, read left to right, but there are also examples of monumental inscriptions with alternating, mirrored, or image-interspersed patterns. This shows that the idea of a correct direction for writing was flexible and adapted to context. Ergonomics was subordinate not just to hand position, but to cosmological, religious, and visual principles. For the Maya, writing was a way to communicate with the gods, and the graphic act carried symbolic value far beyond simple linear reading. Beyond the Maya, other civilizations also forged their own paths. The Ethiopian script, Ge'ez, for example, developed in the Horn of Africa with a syllabic system written left to right, but with unique strokes adapted to local materials and language sounds. In southern India, Brahmic systems flourished with their own logic, including varied writing directions in religious and ceremonial texts. Each culture shaped its writing to meet linguistic needs, the physical characteristics of the scribes, and the rituals involved in recording knowledge. This shows that writing didn't emerge purely from practical function, but also from each people's worldview. The varied directions of these scripts revealed that the determining factor was not just hand dominance, but cultural environment and text purpose. In contexts where writing had liturgical or decorative roles, such as Mayan inscriptions or Indian manuscripts, immediate legibility wasn't always the priority. Often, writing was meant to be contemplated before being read, creating a visual and spiritual experience. This directly influenced form, medium, and direction. Yes, the right hand was commonly used, but that didn't automatically mean writing from left to right. The gesture could adapt to curves, columns, or ceremonial spaces. The Maya, for example, didn't have papyrus, parchment, or paper like the Egyptians or Chinese. They used materials such as limestone, stucco, ceramics, and pressed plant fibers. This directly impacted how writing was executed. It had to adapt to the relief of surfaces and the available space, making graphic patterns more modular and less linear. Characters were fitted into blocks, often forming a narrative mosaic that made sense only within a broader visual context. These ergonomic and material factors contributed to writing direction being shaped by much more than simple hand use. It's important to remember that these systems weren't variants of a single global model, but autonomous inventions. Mayan script, for example, has no direct relation to Mesopotamian, Egyptian, or Phoenician systems.
It was created independently as an expression of Mesoamerican cosmology and religious administrative needs. This reinforces the idea that writing is a cultural technology, not a biological one. There is no correct direction encoded in the human brain. Each society, in its time and place, developed different solutions to represent language based on its environment, tools, and symbols. Therefore, when we look at the variety of writing systems developed outside the Euro-Mediterranean sphere, we see that left to right is just one of many possibilities. Writing direction reflects not only physiological aspects, but also cultural, religious, material, and aesthetic choices. Civilizations like the Maya prove that it's possible to build rich and functional systems with logic completely different from those we inherited. This invites us to let go of the idea that there's a natural way to write, and instead view writing as a mirror of human diversity.
When encountering a text in an unfamiliar language, one of the first questions that arises is, which way should I start reading? Although it may seem simple for someone accustomed to a single writing system, the direction of reading varies across cultures and scripts. Fortunately, even without understanding the content, it is possible to identify visual clues that indicate the correct direction. These cues are not random. They reflect cultural traditions, graphic logic, and the ergonomics of writing. Carefully observing the layout of the page, the arrangement of text blocks, and how the characters are distributed is the first step in this decoding process. One of the main clues lies in the margins and alignment. In systems like Latin-based scripts, the left margin is usually aligned, while the right is ragged, as we read from left to right. In languages like Arabic and Hebrew, this logic is reversed. The right side is aligned and the left margin appears irregular. Simply observing which side of the text appears more straight and which is more uneven gives a strong indication of the expected reading direction. In vertical columns, as seen in traditional Chinese, the tops of the characters typically point toward the start of the reading flow, reinforcing a vertical pattern. In addition to margins, the internal structure of the characters can also offer hints. In many languages, the strokes are drawn in a way that is more open at the start and more closed at the end. This happens because writing systems evolved to favor the natural movement of the hand, which is visually reflected in letter shapes. If observed carefully, the beginnings of characters tend to be more defined, while the ends are more tapered or connected. Reading in the opposite direction breaks this fluidity, and the characters may appear visually distorted or reversed, signaling that the reading flow is incorrect. Punctuation marks are another important tool in determining reading direction. Even without understanding grammar, one can recognize that periods, commas, quotation marks, and parentheses follow conventional order. In Western languages, periods appear at the bottom right of the line, marking the end of left to right reading. In reversed systems, this punctuation ends up on the left. In vertical scripts, punctuation flows downward along the column. If a text appears to begin with a period or comma, it's likely being read backward. The logic of opening and closing these marks also provides strong guidance. Other clues can be found in complementary graphic elements. Page numbers, chapter titles, headers, and footers are usually placed where the reading begins. In left-to-right books, odd-numbered pages appear on the right and even-numbered on the left. For languages with opposite reading flow, this setup is reversed. If a book seems to start from what we consider the back cover, it's a strong sign the language reads right to left. Even the side where the spine or binding appears in physical materials like books and notebooks can reveal the direction of reading. The layout of illustrated texts, such as comics or manga, also provides visual clues. Japanese manga, for example, follows a specific order, top to bottom and right to left. This visual organization helps the reader follow the narrative flow, even without knowing the language. Reading it the wrong way causes immediate confusion, as dialogues and actions lose sequence.
This technique is especially useful when analyzing visual storytelling, where illustrations accompany text. In such cases, the layout itself reveals the structural logic of reading and reflects deep-rooted cultural traditions. Even the act of attempting to read can be revealing. Trying to read a text in the wrong direction often feels visually uncomfortable. Words seem fragmented, characters connect in strange ways, or spacing feels unnatural. This sensation of visual breakdown is a critical cue. In many languages, like Arabic, certain diacritical marks only appear in specific positions within a word. Reading in reverse misplaces these marks, making the text illogical, even for fluent readers. In this way, the body of the text itself resists backward reading, offering an intuitive answer to the attentive observer. Ultimately, knowing how to identify the reading direction is not just useful for travelers or language scholars. It is also a tool for visual literacy and cultural respect. Each writing system carries its own history, logic, and ergonomic rules. Learning to observe and interpret these cues allows a first connection with the unknown, even before decoding the words themselves. It proves that reading is not just about understanding letters, but also about interpreting signs, patterns, and directions. In this context, reading begins with the eyes, long before it reaches comprehension.
Writing did not develop in a vacuum. It has always been closely linked to the human body and the tools used. When we consider how humans write, especially with the right hand, dominant in about 90% of the population, we realize that certain movements are more natural and fluid than others. This fluidity may have determined writing direction. For example, moving the hand from left to right allows the writer to keep the text visible while writing, avoiding obstruction by the wrist. This is one of the ergonomic reasons often cited for the adoption of left-to-right writing in several cultures. The physical medium used for writing also played a crucial role. Civilizations that wrote on clay tablets, such as the Sumerians, needed to press styluses into moist surfaces that later hardened. In such cases, writing direction was less about ergonomic fluidity and more about local convention and symbol orientation. On the other hand, when papyrus and paper became widely used, especially in Greek and Roman cultures, the lightness of these materials allowed more freedom of movement, and ergonomics began to play a more decisive role. The use of liquid ink also demanded care to avoid smudging, which further influenced the preference for more efficient writing directions. The writer's tool also directly affected hand movement. A brush favors long, flowing strokes and requires a different hand rhythm compared to a chisel or a feather quill. A fountain pen demands control to avoid ink blotches, while a ballpoint pen allows constant pressure and faster writing. These details may seem trivial, but when applied over centuries, they shape not just calligraphic styles, but entire cultural habits around writing. A civilization that wrote from left to right, for example, might have done so because their ink and brushes dried slowly, and writing right to left would smear the text. The writer's body position in relation to the writing surface was also important. Imagine an Egyptian scribe kneeling before a papyrus sheet on the floor. Now imagine a medieval monk writing on an inclined wooden desk. Physical posture and writing environment shaped the most comfortable and efficient motions. Sometimes the writing surface was fixed, while the body moved around it. In other cases, the arm was rigid, and only the fingers did the work. These anatomical factors influenced cultural choices, which eventually became traditions, and traditions over time became norms. Laterality is also relevant. Peoples who adopted right-to-left scripts, like the Arabs and Hebrews, likely followed ancient traditions, but also adapted to the way they held their pens or brushes. Since most people are right-handed, this movement might seem counterintuitive, but the surface, writing method, and arm position made it feasible. So even when going against natural ergonomics, other cultural and material factors balanced it out, showing that writing direction resulted from a complex web of interactions. Moreover, writing direction was also tied to practical reading and production needs. In papyrus scrolls, the direction often followed the way the scroll was unrolled, typically from left to right, if the right hand was dominant. On vertical surfaces like walls or pillars, writing could go downward or even be bidirectional. This demonstrates that direction was not purely aesthetic or random. It was a pragmatic adaptation to physical, visual, and manual conditions at the act of writing. In summary, the so-called physical hypothesis argues that the human body, combined with available materials, shaped writing practices. Hand ergonomics, ink drying time, surface type, and writing posture were decisive factors. Together, they formed a set of constraints that influenced not only what was written, but how it was physically recorded. And once a standard was established, it was passed down through generations, eventually becoming a cultural norm, even if the original physical reasons no longer applied.
Leonardo da Vinci left behind thousands of manuscript pages throughout his life, covering subjects such as anatomy, engineering, botany, mathematics, and everyday observations. A constant feature in these records is his so-called mirror writing, written from right to left, with the letters horizontally reversed. This pattern does not appear occasionally, but systematically, indicating that it was not a one-time experiment or exceptional technique. Mirror writing was the natural way Leonardo recorded his ideas in his personal notebooks. To understand it, one must observe not only the content, but also the physical and practical context in which these texts were produced. For a long time, this writing style was interpreted as a deliberate attempt to conceal information. However, that explanation loses strength when analyzing the actual content of his manuscripts. Much of the notes contain no secrets, codes, or sensitive material, but rather technical observations, lists, sketches, and personal reflections. Moreover, reading the texts with a mirror requires no special knowledge. This led historians to seek more consistent explanations, moving away from symbolic interpretations and toward concrete factors tied to the physical act of writing and the material conditions Leonardo faced daily. One of the central elements in understanding this practice is the fact that Leonardo was left-handed. When writing with wet ink from left to right, a left-handed person tends to drag their hand over the freshly written text, smudging the ink and making it harder to read. Writing from right to left eliminates this problem, as the hand follows the progress of the text without touching already written lines. In this sense, mirror writing emerges as a practical and functional solution, not as an aesthetic or intellectual choice. Leonardo's case shows how writing direction can be directly influenced by the ergonomics of the dominant hand. The materials used by Leonardo reinforce this explanation. He mostly wrote on paper, using ink and quills, tools that are sensitive to contact and drying time. Unlike writing on stone or clay, writing with ink demands fine motor control and attention to the medium. In this context, the direction of writing had a direct impact on recording efficiency. Mirror writing allowed greater fluidity, fewer interruptions, and less wear on the materials, favoring the fast-paced note-taking that Leonardo maintained in his notebooks. Another relevant point is that Leonardo did not use mirror writing in all situations. When he needed to communicate with others, write formal letters, or produce texts intended for public reading, he wrote in the conventional left-to-right direction. This demonstrates that he fully mastered the established standard, and that his mirror writing was not the result of inability, but of contextual choice. He adapted the direction of writing according to the purpose of the text, distinguishing between personal records and external communication, further reinforcing the functional nature of his practice. Leonardo's example also helps us understand that cultural standards do not entirely suppress individual adaptations.
Even in a Europe where left-to-right Latin script was already established, alternative practices could coexist in specific contexts. Leonardo's mirror writing did not create a tradition, but it reveals how writing direction can be flexible when faced with concrete physical needs. This individual case interacts with broader historical processes, in which materials, tools, and the human body shaped entire writing systems. Thus, Leonardo da Vinci does not represent an isolated exception, but a well-documented example of how ergonomic factors can influence writing direction, even within already standardized systems. His mirror writing connects the individual level with the historical, showing that writing direction is not only a cultural abstraction, but also a practical response to the physical conditions of writing. By observing his manuscripts, we can understand that the history of writing is shaped not only by large collective traditions, but also by solutions adopted by individual hands facing real physical limitations.
In ancient China, long before the invention of paper, the most common medium for recording written information was bamboo. But it wasn't simply writing on fixed stalks. The bamboo was cut into narrow, long strips, which were then perforated at the ends and tied together with cords, forming a kind of articulated scroll. Each bamboo strip functioned as a vertical line of text, and reading took place from top to bottom on each strip, progressing from right to left across the set. This specific physical format had a direct and profound impact on the Chinese writing convention for centuries. The choice of bamboo as a medium was not merely cultural, but a practical response to the abundance of this material in the Chinese territory. Because it was strong, flexible, and widely available, bamboo became an ideal base for official records, administrative texts, and philosophical works. However, its cylindrical shape imposed limitations. Writing horizontally would require more effort, imprecision, and wasted space. Writing vertically along the natural grain of the bamboo, on the other hand, allowed more control and better use of the surface. The top-to-bottom orientation emerged as a direct consequence of this adaptation to the physical medium. Beyond the vertical direction, the layout of the strips also influenced the direction of reading and text progression. Since the scrolls were rolled from left to right, reading occurred from right to left, reflecting the logic of unrolling the content. This convention remained rooted even after the transition of paper, showing how an initial technical choice can crystallize culturally and persist even when the material conditions change. Bamboo, therefore, not only supported writing, it shaped how content was conceived, organized, and read. This structure deeply influenced Chinese visual thinking. Characters were designed to fit within small square spaces, vertically stacked, respecting the structure of the strips. Unlike the Latin alphabet, which favors linear and horizontal development, Chinese characters were organized to remain legible and balanced within these vertical columns. This created a distinct visual aesthetic and a different way of organizing thought, where the flow of ideas follows the brush's descent along the bamboo surface. Even with the invention of paper during the Han Dynasty in the 2nd century BCE and its later widespread adoption, the convention of writing vertically and reading from right to left remained the standard for millennia. This demonstrates how initial material practices create habits that go beyond the original medium. Vertical writing continued to be used in calligraphy, official documents, and books, even when the technology already allowed other forms. The materiality of bamboo transformed into cultural tradition, and the practice remained alive even in media that no longer required such physical limitations. The persistence of these directions reveals something fundamental about how writing is linked not only to language, but also to bodily gestures, object layout, and the symbolic heritage of materials.
Writing on bamboo required a downward movement and a specific body posture, physically reinforcing the vertical direction. When bodily habits align with writing tradition, they reinforce its continuity. And over time, even with material changes, these gestures persist as a way of preserving a distinct visual and cultural identity. Thus, the case of Chinese bamboo reveals a central point. The physical medium of writing is not just a neutral container, but an active agent in shaping the rules of visual language. Top to bottom writing and right to left reading were born from practical necessity, but survived as cultural convention. This example shows how a simple detail, like how bamboo strips are tied, can shape centuries of textual practices, influence calligraphy, the aesthetics of books, and even the architecture of thought. In this context, writing is also an act of yielding to the logic of the medium that supports knowledge.
The Greek world represented a profound break from the writing patterns inherited from the East. When the Greeks adopted the alphabet, adapted from the Phoenicians, an important transformation was already underway in the materials used for writing. Instead of relying on rigid surfaces like bamboo or clay tablets, the Greeks began to write on more flexible mediums, such as papyrus and later parchment. Alongside these surfaces, liquid ink began to take center stage. Unlike engraving with styluses on hard surfaces, this new method used brushes or reed pens dipped in ink, which completely changed the mechanics of writing. This technical shift had a direct impact on the direction of writing. Writing with ink on a flexible surface flowed more naturally in a horizontal motion, from left to right, aligning with the natural movement of most people's dominant hand, right-handed. This allowed for a continuous rhythm without needing to lift the writing instrument after every letter or symbol. The new motion, gliding the pen gently, fit much better with horizontal progression. Ink, due to its fluidity and adhesion to papyrus or parchment, eliminated the need to carve deeply into the surface, making writing lighter, faster, and better suited for long lines of text. The Greeks experimented with a curious format called boustrophedon, where the direction of writing alternated with each line, left to right on one, then right to left on the next, mimicking the path of an ox plowing a field. Although clever, his pattern was gradually abandoned in favor of a fixed direction, left to right. This made reading easier, better organized text layout, and proved more efficient for copying or composing long works. This practical choice ultimately shaped Western writing systems for centuries to come. Another important factor in this shift was the type of characters used. While ideographic systems like Chinese required attention to each complex and unique symbol, the Greek alphabet was made of a limited set of letters that could be repeated and combined into countless words. This system favored long, continuous lines that were best laid out horizontally. Fluid ink and repetitive strokes of the alphabet helped reinforce a writing style based on lateral movement, something difficult to sustain with earlier vertical systems. Parchment also played a key role in this transformation. More durable and reusable than papyrus, it allowed for freer text formatting, including margins, columns, and even side notes. These visual elements reinforced the concept of progressive linear reading with a clear beginning and end. Horizontal writing became an integral part of the structure of texts and of how readers engaged with them. This visual transformation of Greek texts would directly influence how knowledge was organized in Western culture. Over time, this new logic expanded beyond the material and became a habit. Left-to-right writing became standard in alphabets derived from Greek, such as Latin. Even as new media emerged over the centuries, from parchment to paper and paper to digital, the horizontal pattern remained.
Ink, therefore, was not just a technical component, but a catalyst for cultural change. It enabled a new gesture, a new layout, and thus a new way of thinking in structure and written language. The revolution initiated by the Greeks was not just one of content, but also of form. By adopting ink and flexible surfaces, they paved the way for a new paradigm in the history of writing, one that favored linearity, fluidity, and visual organization in ways previously unimaginable. Ink did not merely record thought, it shaped it. The direction of writing, the tools used, and the materials chosen became inseparable elements of Western knowledge culture, and their origin can largely be traced to the technical and intellectual ingenuity of the Greeks.
The consolidation of left-to-right writing in Western civilization had a major driving force: Rome. Inheriting the Greek alphabet, the Romans not only maintained this writing direction, but transformed it into an institutional standard. The Roman Empire was vast, multicultural, and required an efficient, standardized, and easily disseminated communication system. Left-to-right horizontal writing served this purpose well, especially as it facilitated reading in administrative documents, legal records, and military orders, or central elements of Rome's bureaucratic machine. As the empire expanded, Rome adopted Egyptian papyrus and later parchment as its main writing surfaces. Both materials encouraged organizing texts in columns or horizontal lines. Furthermore, the Romans began using the codex, an early form of the book with folded and bound pages, which replaced papyrus scrolls. This format further encouraged linear, continuous reading, reinforcing left to right as a natural and efficient direction. The physical structure of Roman books reflected and solidified the linear logic of Western writing. Another factor contributing to this standardization was the expansion of Latin as the empire's official language. Latin writing, derived directly from the Greek alphabet, maintained the same direction. As the Romans ruled much of the known world for centuries, their linguistic practices spread across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. This meant that writing direction was not just a stylistic preference, it was a practical requirement. Local governments, merchants, and scholars had to adapt to Roman standards to integrate with official systems. Beyond the functional and political aspects, there was also a cultural dimension. Roman writing was associated with prestige, authority, and civilization. Being able to read and write like the Romans signified sophistication and belonging to the civilized world. Local elites who sought upward mobility or acceptance within the empire adopted not only the Roman language and customs, but also their writing habits. This created a domino effect. Left-to-right writing came to be seen as correct, while other directions were viewed as archaic or foreign. In Roman institutions, such as the Senate, courts, and military archives, textual clarity and uniformity were essential. Scribes, copyists, and administrators were trained under strict rules of calligraphy and layout. Official documents were organized logically, with margins, spacing, and visual hierarchy, or based on left-to-right reading. This visual pattern would heavily influence medieval manuscripts and the first printed books of the modern era, creating a continuous visual and cognitive link with Roman practices. Even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, its writing practices survived through the Catholic Church, which became the main guardian of knowledge in medieval Europe. Monastic copyist monks preserved classical Latin works, also maintaining the Roman style and direction of writing. These monks copied texts onto parchments and later into codices, using calligraphy that respected the visual standards inherited from Rome. Thus, the left-to-right tradition was perpetuated for centuries, even in an increasingly fragmented world. In summary,
The consolidation of left-to-right writing owes more to the Romans than to the Greeks when it comes to cultural standardization. Rome not only inherited this direction, but institutionalized it and spread it to entire regions where it became deeply rooted. The association of this direction with ideals of order, power, and Roman civilization contributed to its longevity. Even when Rome vanished as a political entity, the visual and cognitive habit of writing left to right was already firmly implanted in the minds and practices of the societies that followed it.
The left-to-right writing direction, inherited from the Romans, not only survived through the centuries, but also became an absolute standard in modern Latin languages. As Latin evolved into French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and other Romance languages, the writing direction remained a solid tradition. Even with all the structural changes in these languages over time, such as shifts in endings, vocabulary, and grammar, the way of writing remained untouched. The consolidation of this pattern was so deep that for speakers of these languages, writing from left to right became as natural as breathing. This process of perpetuation was mainly driven by one revolutionary factor, Gutenberg's printing press. Created in the 15th century, the typographic press not only democratized access to knowledge, but also standardized reading and writing practices. The first printed books used Latin as their base language and followed the left-to-right direction, reinforcing this habit on a continental scale. Printing required linearity and efficiency, and this spatial organization of writing fit perfectly into movable type and page layout. The European typographic model spread rapidly, setting the pace of Western reading for the following centuries. With the advent of printing, the standardization of writing became not only cultural, but also technical. Print shops were organized based on the logic of Western linear reading, and every element, from the order of paragraphs to page layout, reinforced the left-to-right reading. This model was exported alongside books to all regions touched by European colonization. The way people wrote, read, and organized knowledge began to obey this spatial logic. It was no longer just a Roman heritage. It had become a functional requirement that a new written communication systems. This pattern became even more deeply rooted with the creation of modern educational systems, especially from the 19th century onward. In public schools across Europe, the Americas, and their colonies, the Latin alphabet was taught precisely at that direction. Children learned to write using notebooks that opened right to left, with margins always on the left side, reinforcing a linear and continuous reading habit. Education turned left-to-right writing into a universal rule within these cultures. Any attempt to reverse this direction was seen as a mistake or anomaly. The systematic repetition in schools created neurological and motor habits that were hard to change later in life. The perpetuation of this writing direction was also reinforced by technological advancement in the 20th and 21st centuries. Typewriters and later computers were developed based on this spatial structure. QWERTY keyboards, text editors, and graphical interfaces were designed for users accustomed to reading and writing from left to right. Even the programming languages that created the Internet were structured around Western languages. This means that beyond cultural and educational reinforcement, the direction of writing became embedded in all modern technologies. Software, apps, and social media platforms follow this same logic to this day. In the publishing industry and media production, the Western writing standard also prevailed. Books, newspapers, magazines, websites, and digital content are all organized using this visual structure. Page design, title hierarchy, and the positioning of menus and buttons reinforce a Z-pattern reading, from left to right, top to bottom. This shapes not only how we read, but also how we think, plan, and structure ideas. The writing direction became part of Western thought itself, internalized as a cognitive standard.
It influences everything from newspaper layout to how we create slide presentations. As a result, Latin writing direction not only survived, it triumphed. It was standardized, taught, replicated, and naturalized across so many areas of modern life that it seems like a biological choice, when in fact it's a historical construction. The West turned its way of writing into a global norm for everything involving technology, education, and written communication. Even in a globalized world where various writing directions coexist, the dominance of the Latin system imposes its spatial logic. Thus, writing from left to right remains a Roman legacy, perpetuated not by military force, but by cultural, technical, and educational dominance.
From the earliest records of writing, the direction of written marks is reflected far more than simple technical choices. The Sumerians, working with clay tablets, already had to consider hand position in relation to the writing surface. Egyptians adapted a more flexible and artistic approach, adjusting direction according to visual composition. The Phoenicians, in turn, left a more pragmatic legacy, writing from right to left due to carving techniques and inscription practices. The path writing followed was never linear, but shaped by a combination of technological, cultural, and physiological decisions, all of which left traces that remain visible in how we write today. The importance of tools and materials cannot be overlooked. Over the centuries, the type of ink, the structure of pens and brushes, and the form of papyrus, parchment, and later paper had a direct impact on how writing systems developed. Wet ink, for example, favored movements that reduced smudging, which, combined with hand dominance, reinforced more ergonomic writing directions. Writing from left to right, especially for right-handed writers, offered practical advantages by minimizing contact with freshly written text. This technical factor, often underestimated, played a crucial role in consolidating the modern Western standard. Political and military dominance also acted as powerful forces of standardization. With the expansion of the Roman Empire, the Latin alphabet spread across vast territories, either imposed or gradually adopted by conquered peoples. Along with the alphabet came its writing direction, from left to right. Roman authority ensured that this system was taught, copied, and reproduced across generations, effectively displacing older traditions that followed different directions. The weight of administrative authority transformed writing direction into a stable and unquestioned norm for centuries. Tradition itself proved to be one of the strongest mechanisms of continuity. During the Middle Ages, monastic scribes preserved classical texts, maintaining not only their content, but also their visual structure and direction. This commitment to copying texts faithfully ensured that left-to-right writing remained intact, even as societies changed. Later, with the rise of printing and the spread of vernacular languages, the established direction was retained rather than reinvented. This demonstrates how tradition can function as a historical adhesive, binding practices across long periods of time. Psychological and neurological factors also provide important clues. In Western writing systems, readers' eyes move in left-to-right patterns through saccadic motion, which becomes increasingly efficient with familiarity. Research suggests that writing direction influences not only reading habits, but also how people perceive space, time, and movement. In this sense, writing direction is both a product of historical conditions and an influence on cognitive organization. It shapes perception while simultaneously being shaped by it. History, therefore, shows that writing from left to right emerged from a convergence of multiple forces. Hand dominance, writing materials, political power, cultural transmission, religious preservation, and cognitive adaptation all played interconnected roles. There was no single decision point and no single civilization responsible for defining this pattern. Instead, repeated choices made under specific conditions gradually reinforced one another until a stable convention was formed and widely accepted.
Today, writing from left to right feels instinctive to much of the world, yet it is the result of centuries of accumulated history. Every line written carries invisible layers of technological constraint, cultural inheritance, and social organization. Understanding this process reveals how deeply historical forces shape everyday habits. Behind each written line lies a long lineage of human decisions that continue to influence how we communicate and structure meaning. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to receive more videos like this.